Chapter 6. The 1988 elections are little over a year away, and, as is characteristic of electoral politics in our country, the campaigning has been underway for some time now. Candidates, political parties, mass organisations and mass movements are intensely working for position to win, in some instances manoeuvring nominations to project their respective issues and assemble a winning coalition for victory in the general election. Given the time, issues and the stakes, a historic election is in the making. There's that word again, historic. At our last convention 4 years ago we said the 1984 presidential election would be historic. Now we are saying the same about next year's. It may seem to some that the Communist Party views every election as historic. In retrospect, however, the 1984 elections were precisely that, even though the People's Movement was not able to prevent Reagan's re-election. Despite the historic efforts of the forces of political independence, the FLCO's pre-primary endorsement of Walter Mondale, despite the unprecedented breakthrough candidacy of Jesse Jackson, despite the amazing discipline of trade union, Afro-American, Latino and Jewish voters in overwhelmingly rejecting President Reagan by margins of 66%, 90%, 65% and 70% respectively, Reagan was re-elected. Back then, the All-People's Front had not grown to a level at which it was capable of overcoming the extremely difficult odds that were stacked against the anti-Reagan movement, especially the extraordinary limitations of Walter Mondale and the betrayal by some Democrats. The forces of political independence, however, particularly as a result of the united action of Labour and the Afro-American community, were able to meet the difference in the Senate and House races, eroding the Republican majority's margin in the Senate. This laid the basis, 2 years later, for achieving a shift in the political balance in the Congress by virtue of putting an end to the Republican Senate majority. The growth of political independence, though still expressed mainly through the Democratic Party, was only one side of the historic character of the 1984 election. Throughout that election our party warned of what was at stake in terms of policy. Our pamphlet, A Whiff of Fascism, alerted the nation that the 1984 Republican Convention revealed that the reactionary nature of Reaganism had reached a new level, threatening peace and democracy. The Iran-Contragate hearings revealed the existence of an anti-constitutional conspiracy involving the creation of a secret government, a secret junta of military intelligence personnel linked to the top circles of the transnational corporations and the military-industrial complex. This proves the correctness of our estimate of the historic significance of that election and the main direction of development, since that the most extremist forces in the Reagan administration were fully committed to implementing the projection. Paul Warrick, head of the ultra-right Committee for a Free Congress, voiced at the 1984 Republican Convention, were out to change the present political power structure of this country. In some measure they succeeded. The truth is, the Reaganites had gone much further elections 75 down this road than we or anyone else suspected. This why exposing the conspiracy, though extremely important, is not enough. The anti-democratic, anti-constitutional conspiracy must be dismantled. This is the most urgent, immediate task facing all movements. The big question is, how? Goal Reaganism without Reagan. In essence, the secret government which was organized and operated out of the White House is a political counterpart of the monopoly corporations. Like the corporations, it acted in total disregard and defiance of the laws, not only of the United States, but every country. The corporations believe if a trade union is an obstacle to maximum profits, they should be able to close their plants down and open others up, and Cowho's governments openly suppress the labour movement. The Reagan conspirators believe if a progressive government becomes an obstacle to maximum profits, it should be closed down, overthrown and replaced with one that will do Wall Street's bitches ding. The anti-democratic, fascist essence of the conspiracy should cause the party and the mass movement to give a great deal more thought to what the ultra-right mean by Reaganism without Reagan. The nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, the stacking of the federal judiciary with Reaganites' efforts to regain the Republican Senate majority, using control of state legislatures to redistrict congressional districts to the benefit of right-wing Republican candidates, privatizing federal government functions, calls for the early deployment of Star Wars and for funding the Contras well into the term of the next president, all have to be seen in this context. The secret government was amassing the resources and forces to carry out operations on behalf of the corporations and the military monopolies, without the Congress or the people ever knowing about it. Unlike a coup, this takeover of government could go on largely unseen. Without congressional oversight and restraint, undeclared wars could be conducted, components of Star Wars could be put in place. And if there were a legal challenge, the court stacked with Reaganites exercising judicial restraint would simply say that such actions were not prohibited by the original intent of the framers of the Constitution. Defense of the nation's democratic institutions and constitutional system of government now must take the growing tendencies toward authoritarian, dictatorial rule head on. Congress must be moved to take legislative mean laws are needed to impose the sternest criminal punishment for the abuse of power, circumvention of Congress, and jurors to dismantle the conspiracy. Violation of federal officials' oath of office. There is also the need for legislation to drain the federal government structure of the cesspools that continually spawn anti-democratic, anti-constitutional conspiracies from McCarthyism to Watergate to Iran-Contragate. This means abolishing the SIA, the exchange pool that National Security Council shifts cadre back and forth between the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies and monopoly corporations, especially the military monopolies. An independent mobilization by the trade unions and mass people's organizations is necessary to wage a relentless struggle for decisive congressional actions. But the party must help the mass movement face the fact that while some practical results are certainly possible, the present composition of Congress is a serious obstacle to enacting legislation corresponding to the level of the endangered 1988 elections. It is 77 this reality that amplifies the historic significance of next year's presidential and congressional elections. They offer the broadest and most direct avenue for the intervention and independent action of the masses against the Reaganite conspiracy. The old slogan, "Throw the rascals out," could not be more appropriate. Referendum on conspiracy the deeper, or profound second thoughts that tens of millions of Americans are having about Iran-Contragate will begin to crest into action just as the primaries get underway. This will inevitably turn the 1988 elections into a pitch battle between the ultra-right and the All-People's Front and a referendum on the Reaganite conspiracy. In 1984, the People's Movement was not strong enough to prevent Reagan's re-election. In 1986, with the unity of the trade union movement, the Afro-American and Spanish-speaking communities as its chief dynamic, the All-People's Front turned a 53-47 Republican Senate majority into a 45-55 Republican minority. The 1988 elections will be a settling of the score. None of the candidates for the Republican prison nomination represent a break with the anti-democratic conspiracy, with Reaganomics or the Reid and Chilgan doctrine. And many Republican senators and representatives up for re-election have chosen to defend the president, no matter what. This sharply focuses the elections into the framework of all people's unity. Post-1986 congressional election period has seen the re-emergence of moderate forces in the Republican Party. This is also evident in the mixed, but generally positive role played by one or two Republican senators during the Iran-Contragate hearings. However, the absence of a moderate candidate for the Republican nomination demonstrates that this wing is unity, the only way not strong enough to wrest control from the ultra-right. Therefore, the entire Republican primary field, in spite of whatever differences may exist among them, is in line with the ultra-right strategic objective of Reaganism. Without Reagan, none will or can run on any basis other than defending the direction of the Reagan administration. Even if they wanted to, and apparently they do not, none can win the nomination without the approval and support of the ultra-right forces that dominate the Republican Party. The dialectics of the emerging political situation heading into 1988 are such that the Democrats have no choice but to challenge Reagan's record and try to offer a credible alternative. This is because they have no alternative. From both the positive 1986 congressional election experience and the negative Mondale experience, the mass constituencies of the Democratic Party have made it absolutely clear that they will not turn out for Democrats who try to out-Reagan Reagan. The failure of Walter Mondale to present a clear anti-Reagan alternative in the 1984 general election undermined the mobilization of the trade union movement, Afro-American community and other independent forces. But in the 1986 election, when the issue of ending Republican control of the Senate was clear, the independent forces, sections of the regular Democratic Party, and large numbers of voters responded accordingly. In several instances, the coalition of the forces of political independence succeeded in electing the more democratic candidates in the primaries. This guaranteed that Republican incumbents would face a liberal anti-Reaganite opponent in the 86 general election. With the All People's anti-Reaganite framework elections 79 clearly established, voters responded even in races in which defeating a Reaganite incumbent meant electing a conservative Democrat. The anti-Reaganite dynamic and the All People's electoral unity was such that even the conservative Democrats were compelled to conduct their campaigns on the basis of challenging the pro-Reagan stance of the incumbents on specific issues. Therefore, the ousting of many of the most reactionary incumbents also sent a powerful message to the conservative Democrats elected to replace them. The lesson is clear. When presented with a choice of a Democrat who is a sanitized version of a right-wing Republican and a Reaganite, key sectors of the electorate simply stay at home. The failure of the Democrats to conduct next year's campaign on an anti-Reagan basis in the primaries and the general election, which would allow the mobilization of all people's electoral unity, could return the Republicans to the White House. Political independence. The growth of the role of the forces of political independence is the difference in the results of the 1984 and 1986 elections. Their influence and ability to mobilize continues to develop at a rapid pace. This is particularly true in respect to the strength of Labour's independent political apparatus, the high level of political independence and discipline of Afro-American voters, as well as the deepening and broadening of the cooperation and coordination between the trade union movement and the racially oppressed communities. The growing influence and strength of the forces of independence has become a barrier to the right-wing forces within the Democratic Party. So far, the combination of shifty mass thought patterns and the ability to mobilize the independent forces has left the Democratic Party's right wing without a consensus candidate. This reflects the impact of the All People's Front against Reaganism on the struggle over direction of the Democratic Party. It also demonstrates that the centre of gravity in that struggle is shifting in favour of left-of-centre positions. At the moment, this is working chiefly to the benefit of the more liberal candidates. Despite sharp differences among some of the candidates for the Democratic nomination, especially on economic issues, trade policy and the extent of willingness to challenge Reagan's foreign policy, a broad consensus on a number of pivotal issues is emerging. All the Democratic candidates resolutely condemn the Iran-Contra conspiracy. Most see it as a threat to constitutional rule. All favour concluding far-reaching arms control agreements with the Soviet Union aimed at ending the nuclear arms race. All oppose Contra aid. All oppose constructive engagement with apartheid. All oppose confirmation of Robert Bork as Supreme Court Justice. All call for reversal of federal spending priorities, proposing to spend more on jobs programs, education and other social needs. All, including those with an anti-Labour past, actively seek trade union support, all implicitly rejecting Gary Hart's divisive 1984 special interest charge. So far, they have all rejected the advice of the right-wing top Democratic Party officials. Despite the likelihood of a Jesse Jackson primary bid, all of the other candidates seek Afro-American support. To date, none are doing so on the basis of Jackson isn't electable themes. 1988. Elections 81. The broadly liberal to progressive direction of most of the Democratic candidates on many issues reflects the massive pressure from below, from the grassroots and the rank and file around the country. This consensus reflects the tremendous pressure the forces of political independence are putting on the Democratic Party to field a nominee who can become the medium for the level of mass mobilization necessary to defeat the Republicans. If this consensus among the candidates continues to develop, it will help create a framework favorable for the nomination and election of candidates at least partially committed to the issues. This in turn would be conducive to the nominee becoming a vehicle through which the All People's Front, the forces of political independence in particular, could wage an all-out campaign against the Reaganites on all levels of the election. To the extent that the primaries take an anti-Reagan, all people's unity direction, to the extent that the independent forces, regardless of which candidate they support, work to strengthen all people's unity, mobilize around the issues and pressure the candidates to focus on policy not personality, to that extent the nominee will be compelled to wage his or her campaign along similar lines. The All People's Unity framework of the elections, which by definition embraces regular Democrats including not only Liberals but centre and right of SinCal, does not lessen the fight for political independence or the role of the independenter forces as well forces. On the contrary, the outcome depends on the unity, mobilisation and especially the initiative of the broad forces of political independence. Without their initiative and self-action, the candidates, the primaries, the convention and the nominee could take a direction that plays into the hands of the ultra-right, undermining prospects for victory in November 1988. High stakes, great importance has to be attached to what happens in the Democratic primaries. The question of emerging from the primaries and the Democratic Convention with all people's unity intact, if not strengthened, is a basic challenge to all forces, especially to the broad left crystallising within the trade union and people's movements, as well as to our party. What's at stake? A Republican victory would give new impetus to Reaganism. Without Reagan, a Republican victory would recharge every slimy, corrupt, anti-communist, pro-fascist, racist, anti-union element of imperialism. The anti-democratic conspiracy could very well pick up a new head of steam. Every communist, every trade unionist, every peace activist, every opponent of racist and anti-Semitic violence, every voter who wants a better life, should ask him or herself a few basic questions. If the Republicans hold the White House, are prospects for new disarmament agreements increased or decreased? Will the basis for stopping Star Wars be lessened or enhanced? Are nominations of more Robert Borks more likely or less likely? Is an escalation of the undeclared wars against Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique and Afghanistan more or less likely, including the introduction of U.S. troops in Central America? In the struggle to preserve life on Earth, enormous weight rests on the shoulders of the people of the United States. The ability of our working class and broad masses from all strata to make their contribution is linked to the level of democracy within our country. The CON 1988 elections 83 spiracy did not take over completely because of the barriers erected by the people's fight back. Mass movements, struggles and actions on all the basic issues: trade union rights, the struggle for equality, struggle against racist and anti-Semitic violence, for jobs, against plant closings, Sures, hunger, homelessness, farm foricul, flow into the struggle to maintain democracy, which is inseparable from maintaining peace. The level of democracy, defending all existing democratic rights while struggling to advance democracy, is what's at stake in 1988. Unless the Republicans are defeated in the presidential election, it will be extremely difficult to dismantle the conspiracy. Either outcome, a Democratic or Republican victory, underlines the importance of achieving a further shift in the political composition of the House and Senate. Such a shift will be a crucial counterweight against another ultra-right administration, but it would also be an indispensable lever of pressure on a Democratic president to carry out campaign promises. 18 Democratic and 15 Republican senators and the entire House of Representatives will be up for re-election. The dynamics are considerably different from 1986, when the Republicans had to defend 22 seats. All people's electoral unity should be geared to an all-out, coordinated effort to defeat as many ultra-right Republicans as possible and some Democrats, as anti-Reagan sentiment continues to surge in response to the Iran-Contra exposes ultra-rightists who seem unbeatable today will become increasingly vulnerable tomorrow. This will be particularly true of the pathetic apologists and unabashed advocates of fascist conspiracy on the Senate and House Select Committees: Senators Orrin Hatch, Utah, James McClure, Idaho, and Paul 84 Tribble, Virginia, Representatives James Courter, New Jersey, Michael DeWine, Ohio, Bill McCollum, Florida, Henry Hyde, Illinois, and William Broomfield, Michigan. Overcoming divisions, building unity. All people's electoral unity is a slogan, not only for analytical purposes, but a guide for practical initiatives. Defeating the Republicans and the ultra-right in the presidential election is an enormous political, organizational, tactical and financial task. It cannot be achieved by the trade unions alone, by the Afro-American people alone, or by the independent forces alone. Winning a presidential election means winning any combination of 270 electoral votes. This includes possibly states where the trade union movement is weak, where Afro-Americans are Spanish-speaking. It means the nominee must win in states where Labour has its strength and where the racially and nationally opposed are not heavily concentrated. Pressed are heavily concentrated. Winning requires the unity in action of all forces opposed to the Reaganite conspiracy for any reason and to any extent. It will require huge financial and organizational resources. Only a united struggle for progressive policies throughout all phases of the campaign will give the forces of political independence the leverage to influence or compel the respective candidates to accept positions supported by the All People's Front. This approach of all people's electoral unity demands an unprecedented mobilization by Labour, the Afro-American, Mexican-American and Puerto Rican communities, peace forces, the women's movement, the seniors movement, the youth and students and other mass movements and forces. In no way is this in conflict with seeking paths of united action with Labour 1988 elections, ALS and others 85 who associate with broad forces. Focusing on the issues and projecting political independence is not in conflict with defeating the Reaganites, but requires tactical flexibility and a realistic appraisal of what is necessary. The only absolute tactic is the necessity of the forces of political independence directing their fire against the ultra-right. The struggle to defeat the Reaganites in the presidential election, to further shift the political balance in Congress, to elect more trade unionist women, Afro-Puerto Ricans, Mexican-Americans, Americans, Asian Pacific Americans, American Indians and to cut the number of Republicans in state legislatures, will help lay the basis for the trade union and people's movements to go over to the offensive. The Afulcio's Democracy at Work project has been underway for several months. It is aimed at guaranteeing the involvement and input of the rank and file in determining the Federation's endorsement. Most international and national unions have been gearing up for over a year, likewise for many central and state labour bodies. There is a broad debate within the labour movement over candidates and tactics. Civil rights movements, groups and organisations within the respective communities of the racially and nationally oppressed, the peace movement, the women's movement, senior citizens organisations are all moving along parallel lines. There is considerable discussion and planning for building up the maximum impact. Resources and personnel are being mobilised for massive voter registration and education campaigns. With the many prospects, there are also problems. Foremost is unity. It is obvious to all realistically minded people that, defeating the Republican pressure in practical terms, 86 unity, the only way candidate in 1988 means electing someone on the Democratic ticket. It is equally clear that as the independents continue to grow, most will struggle through the medium of the Democratic Party in both the presidential and congressional forces of political elections. However, the present 7, possibly 8 or 9 candidates in the Democratic primaries will divide key segments of the independent forces and basic sectors of the All People's Front. This is built into this situation. With so many candidates who have so many similarities, divisions according to candidate preference or personality are also inevitable. In fact, the big business media would like to reduce the whole election to personality, figuring if it sold Reagan it can sure sell a Bush or a Dole. The divisions may be inevitable, but they are not desirable, especially since this situation will lead to multiple divisions within the specific sectors of the independent forces, between different sectors of the independent forces, and between the independent forces and regular Democratic Party forces. For example, it appears unlikely that the 2/3 consensus required for a pre-primary endorsement will be achieved by the time of the Afulcio convention this October. Thus, it is likely that a number of major unions will end up supporting different candidates in the primaries. This will help the more progressive candidates. But it also means organised labour will be divided throughout the primaries, possibly diluting its resources and influence. It will also result in sections of the trade union movement being pitted against the Afro-American community, sectors of the women's movement, much of which will go with the Kroger, and the peace movement, which most likely will split elections 87 among the candidates with the strongest disarmament positions. The maximum unity on policy, the minimum disunity over personalities, is decisive to controlling divisions in the primaries. This tactical approach will allow the independent forces to push, pull and pressure the candidates they support toward policy positions corresponding to the consensus positions of the labour movement, peace forces, the racially and nationally oppressed. It will allow them to pressure candidates also on the overall all people's demands for action to safeguard world peace and democracy in our country. The Jackson campaign, even though he has yet to formally declare his candidacy, Jesse Jackson's second run for the Democratic nomination is generating interest and excitement. And rightly so. He is working hard to broaden his appeal and expand his mass base, and not without success. His focus on the issue of economic justice, plant closings, farm foreclosures, equality is bringing him wide support among industrial workers, sections of the labour movement, farmers, as well as victims of racism and discrimination. Jackson's 88 campaign most likely will exceed his 1984 primary achievements when he won 4 states, came in second in a host of others, took 61 congressional districts and received 3.5 million votes, nearly 700 of which came from white people. Some expect him to go to the convention with one of the largest blocks of delegates. The Jackson campaign has all the makings of a his achievement. It can become an unprecedented vehicle for black-white unity, for focusing on basic issues of concern to working people and for projecting alternative programs reflecting the changing mass-taric thought patterns. 88. Unity, the only way the more advanced of the independent forces side and outside of the Democratic Party will tend to coalesce around Jackson's candidacy. His campaign will also attract large numbers of voters and activists previously inactive in electoral struggle. The Jackson candidacy can become a prime mover and shaker, helping to keep the focus on the issues and on anti-Reagan voter mobilization. By its very nature, the Jackson campaign advances the struggle against racism, projects the issue of Afro-American and minority representation, progressive candidacies, labor movement, black community unity, and Jackson's concept of a rainbow coalition that includes labor and farmers and of a coalition of progressive Democrats will also contribute to all people's unity and political independence. Party in the 88 elections. While we wish the best of success for all progressive candidates, our party does not endorse any other party's candidates. This 24th convention should go on record proudly declaring the Communist Party's intention to field its own presidential ticket. As a party, our tactical focus is not on personalities, but working in and with the broad forces of independence. It is on pushing for policies, programs and slogans that will mobilize masses into an all-people's electoral front to defeat the Reaganites. Our task is to be with the masses on the levels at which they are willing to fight for a meaningful alternative to Reaganism. In the context of the elections, this calls for our party's fullest involvement with the independent forces in the electoral arena, in the primaries, in the congressional and state legislative races, in the conventions, campaigning in the general elections, in the political elections, 89 action apparatus of trade unions and other mass organizations, around legislative issues, like the Bork confirmation fight, and the battle over contra-aid, in voter registration and get-out-the-vote drives. Communists should display maximum initiative in all organizations they belong to, help lead trade unions, have contact with for civil rights, civil liberties and senior citizens organizations, the youth and student movement, community coalitions. We should strive to be the driving force for all people's unity, for minimizing division, preventing diversions and provocations. It is clear that the party must make a major contribution in the ideological field. This means not only exposing the Reaganites, but also policies and concepts that undermine all people's unity and the mobilization of the independent forces. We should be especially helpful and skillful in exposing the anti-union and racist essence of notions like Labour has too much influence in the Democratic Party, or with this or that candidate, or that Jesse Jackson can't win, or that Pat Schroeder, Michael Dukakis or Paul Seaman aren't electable, meaning for reasons of race, ethnic background, gender or religion. Party and people's daily world should display skill and sensitivity, but remain principled in dealing with developments that work against victory on election day. Criticism should be constructively placed in this framework. Party candidates, despite all the positives and the potential in the electoral field shown of generally, nevertheless a unique contributor party to all people's electoral unity can make the difference in many races. This includes the independent role our party plays by way of communist candidates. Not even the best of the other candidates formulate their platforms, conduct their campaigns, or respond to new and sudden developments with the benefits of Marxist-Leninist science. It is not sectarian or conceited to say that in 1984 not even the best of candidates would or could expose the whiff of fascism at the Republican convention. This contribution was a service to the whole nation. Others quickly responded, forcing the Reaganites to pull in their horns for the duration of the campaign. We can do it in 88 too. Plus message we get out to millions of voters through our presidential ticket can serve the whole movement, including all honest forces in the two parties and independent forces. Communist candidates will be part of, not apart from, the building of all people's electoral unity. The developing situation, the changing mass thought patterns, calls for the best communist presidential election campaign ever. We should conduct the kind of campaign that continually shares the views of our candidates with the electorate. Unprecedented use must be made of the mass media. Our campaign material should be issued in the millions. Our candidates' positions on key questions should consistently reach opinion makers in the mass movement and the mass media. Our candidates' names and faces should become familiar to tens of millions. The election campaign presents a unique opportunity to present our unique plus. This kind of campaign would multiply the efforts of the whole party. It could extend and deepen the mass base for party building. But it also brings us face to face with a most difficult practical problem, the problem of how to be active on the levels on which the independent forces are concentrating and carry out the increasingly difficult struggle to get our candidates on the ballot. Our party's presidential ticket was on the ballot in 23 states in 1984. However, a number of state leaders 1988 elections laters 91 have increased the number of signatures required to get on the ballot. The result is that we will have a much tougher time to match what we did in 1984. In other words, total mobilization of the party organization on every level would be required. But if we did this, it is doubtful that our party would have the flexibility, resources and cadre available to play its full role. Pressures of the petition drives tend to separate party organizations and activists from full participation in the initiatives of the independent forces in the primaries. In practice, the demands of the petition drives tend to make our presidential campaign one thing and the struggle of the All People's Front another thing. This is a moment precisely when the overall situation calls for the fullest expression of the public presence of the party to be unfolded as part of, not apart from, the building of all people's electoral unity. The party leadership has given detailed attention to this problem and has come up with the following conclusions and guidelines. First, we must fight to get on the ballot in as many states as possible. Second, we must decide that we will use the mass media on levels, surpassing anything we have ever done. This will also make it possible to conduct a nationwide campaign, even if we are not able to get on the ballot in as many states as in 1984. Third, efforts can be undertaken to conduct the campaign in every state where we have party organization or readers of the people's daily world. This must include an aggressive fight for official writing campaigns if necessary. Fourth, we must elevate the legal, legislative and public relations aspects of the fight for access to the ballot. We have to point out that we and other independent forces are in the position of facing more stringent requirements in large part because a broad, united front struggle for ballot access has not been waged during the last 4 years. Fifth, a new breakthrough must be made in the mass circulation and distribution of the people's daily world. Wide use of the will enable our press to become the party's day-to-day candidate and campaigner. We can reach thousands of movers and shakers in Labour, the Afro-American community, peace PD movements, elected officials and activists in other campaigns, and we can reach tens of thousands of voters in practically every state and congressional district in the nation. 6. The word is communist candidates, meaning that our concept of party election campaigns must extend beyond the question of a communist presidential ticket. New impetus and urgency must be given to vastly increasing the number of local candidates. Running more communists for public office is necessary, but all the more so in the context of all people's unity. Communist candidates can make a huge contribution to exposing Reaganite candidates for the House, Senate and especially the White House. Our Marxist-Leninist insights can help explain in the clearest terms the impact this or that policy will have on the local area. We must especially run local communist candidates in those states where we may not conduct petition drives. If we do this, we will not lose ground as a result of not being on the ballot. Our presidential ticket may be on the ballot in fewer states, but more communist candidates running for a wide array of offices will be on the ballot in more states. We need flexibility and innovation in deciding what offices to run for and on which line. More come 1988 elections. 93 Munists running for public office does not mean in all cases running as communists. Some districts and clubs may find running as independents preferable. We should explore every possibility for applying our new electoral tactic of communist left or left progressive electoral fronts. The chief aim of this tactic is to take account of the rapid growth of the party's mass influence as well as the fact that most forces are still not prepared to work directly with us other than in a broader coalition context. On the other hand, the great shifts taking place in the trade union movement and among masses offer new possibilities for united candidacies, joint slates and broad-based independent campaigns involving communists and non-communists. Aiming to win in every case, the party should focus on offices it aims to win, if not in 1988, then over the course of the next few elections. Such a proposition requires a basic change in how we conduct our campaigns. Generally, we are good on program, but come up very short on the mass organisation side of running campaigns. The fact is we have now overcome the barrier that communists cannot be elected even though our candidates' votes and constituencies took a big leap in recent elections. Most of us still do not think in terms of communists actually getting elected. This is the necessary next stage in the development of communist campaigns. To reach this new, higher stage, we must raise the level of professionalism in the use of the media, literature, posters and in fundraising. We must master campaign organisation techniques to identify, mould and hold a communist electoral constituency. We must establish an apparatus to get out the vote on election. Must focus more on door-to-door canvassing and involving non-party volunteers. Shinday 94, a tactical focus for guiding the work of the party in the 88 elections, is designed to make it easier for all members, clubs and districts to take initiatives on all levels, with the basic sectors of the forces of political independence, through all phases of the elections, working for a further shift in the political composition of the House and especially the Senate, achieving a breakthrough in communist candidates, including expanding local candidacies and in party building. Working in this way will not necessarily come easy. It will take unprecedented party unity, mobilization and discipline. For example, focusing on all people's electoral unity to defeat the Republicans in the presidential and congressional elections must be the basis of work of all party organizations and members, with no exceptions. Districts that do not conduct petition drives must be prepared to give substantial help to districts that do. In other words, all party organizations must take an active part in party campaigns. If the party respond in an all-out way, there can be no doubt that we will make a unique, qualitative contribution in helping to determine the next occupant of the White House and who does or does not sit in Congress. If we respond with all cylinders running, we will make a unique contribution to turning our country around to a post-Reagan era of peace, democracy, equality and progress. In this new situation, the party must show boldness, flexibility, imagination, creativity, organisation and discipline. Kind of party we must be. We have to be a party that understands and accepts the task of working with and guiding the spontaneous elections 95 mass movements that objective developments are giving rise to. We have to be a party that accepts class struggle as a primary point of reference, but also understands how it relates to the problems and struggles for all sections of the people. We have to be a party in the forefront of all the struggles for reforms, but rejecting reformism as a way of political life. We have to be a party that understands that the struggle against racism is a special task for a working class party and that it also has to be a part of all struggles, especially those related to the class struggle. We have to be a party that takes a principled stand against imperialism and accepts as its acid test the struggle against US imperialism. We have to be a party that understands the dialectical relationship between fighting for a better life under capitalism and the struggle for socialism. We have to be a party that does not opportunistically succumb to the ideological pressures of big business, a party that sees slander of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries as basically a slander of the working class and of socialism in general. We have to be a party that understands and accepts the science of Marxism-Leninism and that continues to develop it as a guide and a methodology for its work. We have to be a party that is democratic, but with a structure through which it can come to policy and tactical conclusions. We have to be a party that merges the working class movement with socialism, a union of the movement of the present with a fight for the future. This means giving a class struggle content to old struggles for partial demands and reforms. It means making the con-96 connection between the present struggles and the future. If we agree this is what the party must be all about, then we have to say that building party consciousness has to become a way of life. And from this we have to conclude that communists cannot do poor party work while doing good trade union work, good shop work or good mass work of any kind. What you do to prepare workers and people for struggle, demonstrations and strikes should also prepare them for the party. Adding our unique communist plus makes it possible to be a good communist trade union leader, a good communist leader in the struggle against racism, a good communist leader in the struggle for peace, and finally, the tactical response to the new crises and conditions that are ripe for solutions is unity.